Hello, my name is Mark Perry, and today I will be discussing the Bach Chorale number 23, which is examples 3 and 4 in the Salzer music examples. Before I get into the actual piece and pointing out individual chords and notes, I just want to say that this example, this piece excerpt is given in the context of the tonality section, which is discussing how tonality or the implication of modulations or tonicizations might actually serve to, extend or prolong individual chords or embellish individual chords and harmonies rather than sort of take over and create a new tonality. In this particular example, there is a G major chord in an A minor passage. Further than that, there is a D major chord which precedes the G major chord, which at a basic level, if you were just writing out with Roman numerals, the chord grammar of this situation perhaps would imply a modulation, where the 5 of this lowered 7, D major to G major, has enough of a dominant, perhaps tonic motion that one might assume that this is a tonicization, or even further, a modulation, and then try to apply Roman numerals in the key of G major instead. Salzer would argue that this is a bad way to interpret this example, and instead goes on to prove how this G major chord, preceded by its own secondary dominant, is actually just an extension or a prolongation of the A minor chord, the 1. So we're looking at the second full measure of the Bach chorale, the downbeat and the third beat with some passing motion and chord jumps within there. Really the first 3 beats of measure 2 is a G major sonority, primarily again on the downbeat and the third beat underneath the fermata. Preceded by a D major chord, which is the 4th beat of the first measure. We see D, it's an inversion. We see F sharp, A, D, and then D in the soprano as well. And as Salzer has mentioned in other contexts, the lack of root position in this 5, in this secondary dominant or applied dominant, might even be a little clue that there's not enough force, perhaps enough weight with this applied dominant to fully articulate a 5-1 motion, but that's besides this particular point. So the question is, how do these 2 chords fit within the harmonic structure that is laid out here? When looking at the A level analysis right underneath the passage, I will be describing these as the A and B and C levels moving forward. We can see that Salzer has written out a couple of things. First, he has grouped, even though there are bar lines taken out, there is still vertical alignment between all 4 lines, the initial excerpt and then the A, B, and C analyses. You can see that at the end of the first measure, he has written the in between the 2 staves that the D major is an applied dominant, applied to, of course, the G major sonority at the beginning of measure 2, And then you can see in the soprano, it goes from melodically from B up to D, some passing motion. And in the bass, there is neighboring motion, G up to A, back down to G. Before then going to the 5 in first inversion, and then, the 5 of the key, E major in first inversion, and then back to A minor. So what's going on here? Is it as simple as a labeling issue, or is there something else more interesting happening? We've got the applied dominant over top the fundamental harmonic structure of 1, and then 2, 6, 5, 5, 1. Salzer is arguing that, first, the G major sonority, while borrowed from the A natural minor scale, isn't actually trying to create a new tonality. There's no modulation going on. Instead, the G major is simply a lower neighbor chord. There's neighboring motion within the A minor 1 chord. When thinking about the D major, which precedes it, the D major is simply adding interest to that G minor chord. It is increasing the musical interest for the ear. There is some exciting stuff happening, but it's best to not be too distracted by all of the excitingness. The excitement is how some people would say that. When looking at the B level analysis, Salzer has shown, taking away a lot of extra fluff, how in the bass it starts on an A, then there's a lower neighbor at the beginning of measure 2 down to G, and then at the beginning of measure 3 we're back up to A. He also shows there's less interesting but still existent passing neighboring motion in the alto voice from E down to D, back up to E. But then what's interesting is in the soprano, we've got some passing motion from A up to B and then up to C. As mentioned in the Moodle, the NP underneath the middle chord there, that G sonority, it's labeled as an NP, or neighboring passing motion. This is to show that the bass, the outer voice is the bass, there's neighboring motion, and in the soprano there's passing motion, and Salzer finds it important to label both of those things. So neighbor passing motion. But even though there is an applied dominant of a D major, there's not actually any motion going on. There's not harmonic progression, but rather just a harmonic prolongation. The progression does not appear until the second half of the third full measure, as labeled the 2, 6, 5, 5, and 1 in the A through C analyses. Taken a little bit further, because of the interest of and the focus of this particular musical example is about how the G major sonority fits within an A minor framework, my focus also is on that piece as well. Salzer does not really show a lot of focus on the last 2 measures of the excerpt, and my focus likewise will not be on the final 2 measures. Now, looking down at example number 4, Salzer is simply showing how those 2 measures really fit within a framework of an A minor sonority. So at the A level of example 4, there is just a minor chord written out. When looking at example B, he's adding notes to it. We see some passing motion in the soprano from A up to B, up to C, and that motion is mirrored in the first measure of the Bach chorale, the first full measure. In the soprano voice, we can see A up to B up to C, and then there's a, it then goes up to D, but that is an incomplete neighbor, yes, excuse me. And then back to example number 4, the C level, it is now incorporating some bass motion as well. Excuse me. Take me a second to gather my thoughts. I misspoke. The A and B and C are found on the downbeats of the first 3 full measures in the soprano voice. Now, when looking at C of example number 4, he's adding the bass motion to that diagram, showing how we've got the passing motion in the soprano and we've got the neighboring motion in the bass. And then example D is adding a little bit more context to show passing motion in the melody in between those individual notes, just to add more grounding to his explanation. So, ultimately, in conclusion, the way to think about this strange sonority, this borrowed chord preceded by an applied dominant, isn't to suggest a new key. In fact, if we were to go about trying to think about every new false or temporary modulations, as Salzer describes, it would really mess with the cohesion and integrity of music as a whole. Instead, it makes a lot more sense to think about those borrowed and applied chords within the structure of the overarching harmonies. Excuse me. In this case, the G major is serving to prolong the A minor sonority, not progress the harmonies in a new direction. The D major is simply adding interest, adding aural intrigue, and it's best to think about it as such. Thank you.